Hey computer, play About Bees podcast.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of About Bees, Culture and Curiosity with Ron Miksha and
Bidzina Mosiashvili.
Hi Bidzina, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing, Ron?
I'm okay, but it's cold out there. I think it's minus 20 today, and we're going to be airing this episode in the middle of January with some of the coldest weather of the year here in the Calgary area, in Alberta, probably over most of the northern hemisphere. It's about as cold as it will get for the whole year during this next few weeks. So, what are we talking about today then, with this cold weather in mind?
Today we're going to be talking about the do's and do-nots of winter beekeeping.
Okay. Is there such a thing as winter beekeeping?
Well, there were some YouTubers that begged to differ.
Oh? They beg to differ that there is no or there is winter beekeeping.
Maybe I used that incorrect. But yeah, I've watched videos of, even some local beekeepers doing some beekeeping in December here with the weather. And I even saw some beekeepers in Yukon opening up their beehives.
Wow. Are you sure it was filmed in December, opening up the beehives? Maybe in the Yukon it could have been July and it just looked like December.
Well, that's sure. But is there snow out in July?
Could be. That's for sure. So
I've never been
there are people who open their hives in the winter. Would you recommend that yourself? What do you think?
I did do that one of the winters, but it was in BC, and the weather, but there was snow outside. I want to say, it was just maybe a week, or I think I would say end of January, but it was at least, there was snow up to my knees where I was uncovering these bees. I had to shovel snow for almost an hour and a half by hand to uncover them. I have video of it.
Okay, so why were you doing that? Why did you want to uncover your beehives in southern British Columbia, where the temperature usually during the winter doesn't get much below frost, but of course big snows do happen? So what were you doing? What was in your mind? What were you thinking, like, what am I going to do for these bees?
Man, so I put my bees there with no insulation, nothing, uncovered. Although I did put these little rain gutter things. I'll put video up for everybody. It's my own content. So, so there's these rain gutters that I put at the entrance. So I thought in case when it rains or when it snows, their entrance doesn't get snowed in. And that's actually worked really well. So during my uncovering, when I got to the bees, they were completely covered in snow. Some of them almost up to their lids. And I started uncovering them. And then when I got down to that rain gutter part, they have created this area where they were hanging out. Like it was melted, I guess from their own heat that was generated. There was this kind of like igloo domed part of their part where it was once I would break out. And I was
and you wrecked all that.
I did wreck all that, exactly. That they were using that, and
would you do that again?
Would you be? Because what was going in my thought process? I'm like, oh my God, they're suffocating. I gotta uncover them.
Right. A lot of people think that way. A lot of people. You're not the only one. Don't feel too bad about that, because that's a very common error.
By the way.
Pardon?
It was my second year beekeeping.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So you wouldn't do that now. And I saw a video that you still have up that you should take down one of these days. And it shows you chiseling away the ice in front of a beehive. You don't want to do that either, do you? Do you?
Maybe if their entrance is covered over with ice.
No, I think we don't have to worry so much about that or about the snow. I think that's actually a really good protection for the bees. It's a great insulator. You did find when you dug into that mound that they had hollowed out because of the air temperature, the heat they were giving off. They had made a bit of a cavity there with air. I have seen people dig bee colonies out in March or April here in the far north when there is enough, say, willows starting to bloom, but still snow on the ground. And if the bees are behind let's say behind a hedgerow or a row of trees where there's an effect similar to a snow fence that was, stopping the snow and the snow piles up on top of the beehives, they're just as snug as bugs in a rug when you just leave them alone until the time when you think, well, they could be flying now. And then you can dig them out. Other than that, they survive well, completely buried. And some beekeepers, as we learned from Steve Clifford, when we had Stephen on our show a few months ago, he described throwing snow over top of the hives in order to keep them warmer during the winter. Yeah.
And they thrive in high carbon monoxide or dioxide, high carbon dioxide environments, correct?
Yes, they do give off carbon dioxide when they oxidate the honey that they're living off of. That's their food source, and then of course they do expel in their breathing and oxidation process. They do give off carbon dioxide. If they were little cars that you'd buried under the snow, carbon monoxide. But these are bugs, so it's carbon dioxide. And they do that. But apparently, you're going to say something about the level of, what do you know about that? What have you read or what have you heard?
So they thrive in it, high levels of it. They don't need the oxygen level the same oxygen levels as that we think humans need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's true. I think there is a limit where they will eventually suffocate. But I shock a lot of people by telling them that if I had one hive of bees that need to be moved, and that one hive was in a single story, or you can put it into a single story, go in the evening, get a big, huge black garbage bag and slip that over the whole hive and seal it up tightly. And the bees don't need the oxygen that you think they need. They will be just fine in there for several hours until you get to your destination. So if you're moving one hive of bees and you only have a van or a car and you're going to put it in, you want to make sure it's totally sealed in a way that the bees don't leak out and cause mischief in your van. And so you can cover them, like you can park them inside of a big, I'm talking like a trash barrel size garbage bag, and seal it up. And the bees can't get out. You can go where you're going. And when I delivered bees to the Drumheller being one of the towns in central Alberta, Drumheller Correctional Institute, where prisoners are kept, I was teaching them bee courses over a few years, and I would deliver hives all the way up there, which is quite a long trip for me to drive with bees in the van, and I would just park my hive right inside the black garbage bag, and they were fine. Get there, teach for a few hours, and then say, okay, guys, we have got a beehive in the back of my van. We're going to go take it out and park it right outside the warden's house. And then we go do something like that. So bees don't need that air as much as we think they do.
So how long do you think they can live off? Because, there's been cases where bees been transported through over the ocean, from the Pacific, from the Atlantic, and they've died. And a lot of times kind of what I've assumed is they've suffocated or something, but it's usually not. That's not the case. It's usually to temperature related. So, is that right, or is suffocation?
Well, the first honeybee colonies, the first honeybee colonies that came to North America and South America by European settlers did make these long 3-4 week long journeys inside a boat, but they tended to be buried in straw. So the colonies would be set on in a spot with the entrances probably closed, and then straw put over top of them to keep the temperature more moderate as they were traveling. I think that they lost an awful lot of bees. Like, you hear stories of 20 colonies being loaded and 3 being alive at the end of the trip. Now, I kind of figure that most of that loss was due to simply running out of food, that nobody was opening them, looking at them. And I think that with that moderate temperature being covered, on the ocean, so it's not like wintertime where they use very little food, but they were probably pretty active. They were probably buzzing hard inside there. They might not have had moisture or water, which they actually need to survive even in the winter. So I think that probably is what did it more than suffocation.
Right.
Don't think they would have been suffocating. I think they would have been getting enough oxygen through their skep nests and piled under straw as they traveled. But I don't know. I wasn't there. I kind of missed that one. It wouldn't have it been fun to have been one of the pioneers who said, I'm going to put 20 colonies of bees in the back. And the first bees that made it around from the eastern United States out to California, those things sold for the equivalent today of like $10,000 or $20,000 a single hive, because they were so rare. There were no bees there until the settlers brought them, no honeybees or other bees, but to produce honey and to do apple pollination, other types of pollination in California, then they brought bees out there in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. And it was such they would sometimes take them through the Panama Canal or sometimes take them across country. And both of those, I'm guessing, would have been extremely difficult for the bees to survive.
Sorry, I was kind of referring to the using planes in modern times. How?
Okay. I hadn't connected that, but that's a really good point. So there have been problems, but not suffocation as far as I know. I think it's been mostly a matter of heat. Trying to keep the temperature right with the 2,000 packages inside of, and they tend to try to keep the temperature in a cargo hold above freezing, but then there's no way to regulate it when it becomes too hot. And as the bees get hot, they start to dry out and they start to overheat, and that exhausts them. It kills them.
There was an article that happened during COVID. Didn't they use the wrong form of transport cargo to bring bees from New Zealand?
Yes.
And a lot of them die.
Yes, I think they lost the whole load. I think so. That does happen. It's very sad, very unfortunate.
Yeah, maybe I'll put a little. Maybe we'll go if we weren't going to it. I can't really find the article. But
this is a good point. So we're talking about whether or not you should shovel out the bees from under the snow in the middle of the winter. I definitely would advocate not doing it. And if anything, do the Steve Clifford method and throw a little more snow over them, because snow is a good insulator.
Also, when I first started out, I was so worried about over insulating. Even this year, I had some friends come out to help me to wrap the beehives up, and they were worried about me covering up the entrance. They're like, "Aren't they going to suffocate?" And that's our normal intuition. is, aren't they going to suffocate? Because just like with any other pet, we want them to give all the nourishments, and one of them is air. But they don't really need air like we think they need air.
Did you need some flow of air to get rid of too much carbon dioxide? And also, a lot of beekeepers here in the prairies, at least, like to have entrances, both upper and lower, in order for humidity to escape from building up. I have occasionally lost colonies of bees that I had also over-insulated. And the problem there in the spring, opening them up, was everything was dripping wet because I had not had enough places for the excess buildup of water moisture to transpire.
And sorry, so you had it, how long, what time of the year was this?
When I would open the colonies up in March to check on them or to feed them, I have had some winter losses where I've had groups of 4 colonies so well insulated, and either I hadn't left enough of an entrance for them for airflow, or there wasn't like a natural cavity of snow where there would be some air buffer inside of there. Instead, they were like, tightly wrapped, and everything was wet. The colonies, the bees were damp and moldy. The frames were wet. And that happened a year when I went way overboard in wrapping up the colonies for winter.
So, okay, so you could overdo it with over insulating.
Well, I did, and I'm not sure, if I could have still kept that much insulation on, but given them a better way of getting rid of the moisture that was building up. I also should back up just a little bit and explain that the location those bees were kept in was next to a lake and in a kind of a low area. So the ground itself was wet and not to the point where water was getting into the hives, not that kind of wet, but it was just a very damp, humid area and not the typical dry prairie location that I would have been used to for wrapping the bees and sealing them up as much as I would normally do.
Yeah, so I've heard of the case where bees have been covered in the Canary Islands, over 50 days with volcano ash completely, and they've come to see that they've all are alive.
Yes, I saw that too in the news that somebody had gone to check on their colonies. I was really quite surprised because you would think that the lava ash would have been quite hot and would have melted the comb inside, but apparently the bees had survived completely entombed, basically in concrete, and somehow they had enough oxygen to survive inside of there. So I don't think that's our real concern. Suffocation, it isn't. Maybe moisture is, but what I'm a little reluctant to hear people do is to bother the colonies of bees midwinter. And actually, I had I think it was the provincial apiary inspector in Saskatchewan gave me a call a couple of years ago, and he said that a beekeeper with about 50 colonies of bees was located in an area where seismic exploration was going to be conducted. And that beekeeper was really concerned with the trucks and the ignition of dynamite. And a lot of exploration work is done during the winter because the ground is frozen and you can get a really good resonance of the echo from the rock below. And would this disturb the beehives themselves? Well, fortunately, from the way it was explained to me, there was enough distance between the colonies of bees and the explosions of dynamite. And the dynamite is being exploded under the ground. I was more concerned with the heavy trucks rolling around. Plus, they do some land clearing if there are trees so they can run the lines through. And that really worried me. Why I got called was because I do have some experience. I've been on the line with seismic in the past. So I kind of, this particular person didn't know who else to call and ask for somebody who had hands-on experience with things like this. So I told him that it's not a big thud. It's not a really bad, but the concern there was any motion, sounds, disturbances will interrupt that cluster of bees that are trying to go through winter. And if you tap on the hive to remove ice, if you open up the lid and pull it loose and crack open the propolis that had so neatly sealed the lid down in the fall, and then you're opening it up just to satisfy your curiosity or because you think you're going to do some good for them, there is a strong risk that you're going to hurt that cluster, disturb the bees. It could take them days or never before they reform their cluster and come back to a semblance of normality. So you don't want to be shaking, bothering, poking at your colonies of bees in the middle of winter. As much as possible, drive by, take a look outside, maybe go in on the skidoo, but don't tramp around the colonies too much if it's midwinter. If you're really concerned about whether or not you left enough food for them, then that's a different concern. And you may have to take the risk of opening them up and putting on some feed midwinter. But hopefully, beekeepers in general have left enough honey for the bees to survive at least until March. If they're eating half a pound a day, which is normal during the winter, and you have them fed so that there's at least 100 pounds of honey let's go back. Let's say 60 pounds of honey, excess honey that the bees can reach. That's a 120-day supply. That's 4 months of honey, 4 months of food. So with only 60 pounds of honey, they will run out sometime in early March, and you will need to get in there and do something to feed them. And then maybe it's worth taking that risk and bothering the colonies.
Right. So this would be around March time, mid-March. You would.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And the type of weather is important too. Yeah, go ahead, please. You're going to say something.
Just at this point, you would also, when you uncover them, you'd feed them, you would recover them in some cases.
Yes, you absolutely would. Yeah. We can definitely go into that in a bit of detail, but for the moment, I would say choose a day in early March or even late February when the temperature is at least plus 10 and there's no wind, plus 10 being 50 Fahrenheit, and no wind and the sun is out. It's not just a cloudy, overcast kind of wet day, but it's a bright, sunny day with a temperature up and around at least 10, 12, 15 degrees. And then, as briefly as possible, unwrap the colony so that you can just have enough room. Sometimes it's enough to just lift the covering off the top of the hive, depending on what kind of wintering equipment you're using, and be able to get inside and just don't pull any combs out. Just look down. And at this point, you're looking to see, do you have colonies of bees that are alive? Are they alive? And if they're alive, they're almost undoubtedly up near the top, near the lid, because they have been eating for the entire winter, and they usually start near the bottom of the hive and work their way up, so that by March, when you lift up the lid, you should be able to see live bees close to the top. And hopefully, along with those live bees, you'll still see a half dozen or more combs of honey as you're looking down. So you want to train yourself to look into that open colony and be able to recognize large, heavy frames of honey without needing to pull them out and disturb the bees further. You see that honey, you see a nice cluster close to the honey, and it's early March, mid-March. You know you're going to have a few nice days where the cluster can move around to where the honey is sitting. Then you're in pretty good shape. If you don't see that honey, that's the time when you may want to put some auxiliary feed in place. So you might make some taffy or some candy or purchase some material from a bee supply place and put that right on the top of the top frames. and then seal everything back up. Close it all up. Keep it as warm as possible. The bees need that warm cluster insulation material as in the spring more than they need it in the depth of winter. They need it in the spring because they're trying to expand their brood nest. And to expand that brood nest and lay a bunch of eggs on a nice warm day and not be well insulated and then cluster up tightly and abandon some of the brood that they had just put a lot of their resources into developing is really going to set the bees out back badly.
Now, this is kind of a little bit of a side note, but I've heard that clustering is actually, hopefully your bees don't start to do that. You want them to kind of have enough temperature where they can be active all around the frames. When they start to cluster, they start to, that's actually, it's actually not the best for them.
Okay, I haven't heard that. I've always heard that you want a big cluster going into winter with the outer edge of the bees being at a temperature that is close to freezing. And then as you go closer and closer to the center, there's a little more and more activity where the bees are eating honey, generating heat, and keeping the center of that cluster the warmest.
Yeah, I don't know. Let me see.
Oh, no, don't let me see. It means I'm looking at AI. Cat GPT, here we come. Yes, go ahead.
So research. So this is from the beesource.com. It's a bee forum.
Okay, bee forum.
Yeah.
And who writes on the bee forum?
This is Zuby. And he got 56,000 views, 1.2K replies, 45 participants, and it was posted on November 24th, 2023. The post was on February 28th, 2024. So just about, less than a year ago. So research challenges, and I'll put it up on the screen here.
Yeah.
Do you want me to put it up on the screen?
Yeah, of course you should do that. But you could just tell me what the research like challenges.
I could put it up for everyone, but we won't see it for us now.
Okay.
Yeah. So research challenges widespread belief that honeybees naturally insulate colonies against cold by clustering.
Okay. Well, there, folks, I stand corrected. Research is challenging everything I've learned since I was a very kid about bees, but that's fine because I'm open to hearing this story.
And
sorry to be right.
Article goes to psych.org.
Psych. That's PSYCH, like psychology or psychiatry.
Or physics. Sorry, it's phys. It's
Phys. Oh, yeah, physics. Okay, physics is better than psych and talking about heat preservation. Okay,
so a researcher, I already read that. So a lead researcher is keen to help beekeepers shape their practices following his study, which appears to disprove that widespread belief that honeybees naturally insulate their colonies against the cold. His findings suggest that creatures are potentially being subject to thermally induced stress.
Okay.
And then, so the PhD student Derek Mitchell is calling for further debate on ethical treatment of insects, saying his research appears to be contradict a wild accepted theory that bees' reaction to cold temperature is the form of layers of insulation, an idea that has led to bean houses and hives that are extremely poorly insulated compared to their natural habitat. The study, which is published in Journal of Royal Society Interface, looks at honeybee clusters where insects huddle together, forming dense discs between the combs to try to keep some of them above 18 degrees when the outside temperature drops. For almost 120 years, the outer layer of honeybees in winter clusters, known as the mantle, has been said to insulate the cluster core, the honeybees at the center. Adopting the same technique used for measuring heat loss from individuals, from buildings, Mr. Mitchell from School of Mechanical Engineering analyzed this theory. However, his findings indicated that far from acting as insulation, the mantle instead acted like a heat sink, dissipating the heat away from the center. The paper states the cluster mantle does not meet any of the 4 insulation criteria identified and meets all 3 heat sink criteria. Mr. Mitchell said, My findings are controversial because it has become a tenet of beekeeping that the mantle insulates the honeybees. I don't know, I can go. He explains that.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So he is a physicist, engineer who is, yeah. I've got to give some credits to his investigation. It's not what I would have assumed or expected, and 120 years of being wrong is possible. So it sounded to me like he was advocating for the bee not to be suffering, and that one way you don't suffer in nature is by being in well-insulated trees or locations. So it's not he's not saying that we should be ignoring insulation. He's saying that we need lots and lots of insulation, more than we normally put on a colony of bees.
Yes.
And that way they don't cluster.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so he's not saying clusters don't exist.
Yeah, he said clusters not that they don't exist. Yeah, he said that once they start to form a cluster, it starts to act as a heat sink.
Mm-hmm.
The insulation that that beekeepers traditionally believe that it's.
That's right. That's right. I don't know. I guess I would need to know more about that. And you said there were 1,400 replies to this mention back in November of 2023, and people for months were arguing, questioning, or agreeing with these findings.
I do want to that's actually, if you think about when they do form a bee beard, when aren't they trying to drive heat away from the hive but that's to protect it from this direct sunlight.
Well, I don't know if it's as much a protection against the direct sunlight as it is if you consider that 50,000 individuals might be living inside of a smallish couple of boxes on a very, very hot day. The more that move out and sit on the front porch, the more space for air to flow, and the less heat is being generated by those individuals who sit out on the front steps. So I think that's really what's going on. Plus, of course, even with the bee beard, there are some of those honeybees who are actively bringing cooler air into the nest and bringing in water to be evaporated and so on. But yeah, I think the biggest reason we have a bee beard is to reduce the number of individuals inside the colony of bees.
I see. So just going back to that article, I guess I'll just read a little bit of the forum comments if you don't mind.
Yeah, please. This is interesting.
Yeah. So Zuby, the discussion starter, I follow physics.org, and this popped up the other day. It seems reasonable from mechanical engineering aspect, and it's a quick read. TLR. I don't know what that means.
Too long, didn't read. TLDR. Too long, didn't read.
It says TLR, and then it puts a emoji face, and then R.
Okay.
Okay, and then it says and then he ends it, or she ends it with, "We aren't using hives with thick enough walls like trees they would choose naturally. Thoughts? Question mark. I guess that's what you said. Yes, as well.
That's what seems to be the gist of the article's findings, the paper's findings for this PhD candidate, that there should be, in nature, that there would be more insulation. I don't know how true that is. Like, I don't know how many, I guess Tom Seeley would be one person who would have an answer to this question, is how much do bees in nature look for well-insulated locations to go through winter. I know that we in Alberta have actually had photographs distributed, taken of bees midwinter that have been clustered, I'm using that word, outside in a tree, not even inside. They survived a winter. Now, I'm sure that this is a very irregular situation, but they survive without any insulation, just hanging out on some branches of a tree through the entire winter. These are honeybees. So I'd be really amazed to learn more about what happened to that genetic stock. But anyway, his point then?
I guess I'll just, and then, so FB Farm, the responder, I'd go as far as to call it animal cruelty, but I definitely think insulating is a great idea. If it's cold enough inside the hive that they have to cluster, they have to eat more honey to generate heat. Insulation is better for bees and keeper. And
good.
Okay. And once I started and then frightful warmth, these are the user-generated weird,
okay.
Once I started insulating and doing condensing hives, it reduced the amount of food they ate by 50%. I don't see any evidence in my 5 years of beekeeping that bees can handle this, thin-walled hives well. Everything I've seen indicates it stresses them out, especially once the cold, windy weather comes. In warm weather, it doesn't seem to make any difference. So I guess, and then we were talking with Victor with Hive IQ, and he brought up, I don't know, that's where my mind is jumping to, but someone might else brought this up, but he said that Langstroth said that if at the time they could have thicker hives, he wish he could for the walls, but the technology, they didn't have it at the time or something.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
I wouldn't blame it on the lack of technology. There were probably a number of other reasons why they didn't have really thick walls, because I have seen bees in Central Europe kept in colonies that have two walls, and the inside wall was full of insulation. And usually in those, locations, it wasn't pink insulation or polyurethane foam or anything like that. Instead, it was leaves and grass and straw stuck between two walls. And that gave them a lot more insulation. So that would have been possible in Langstroth's day. But yes, two panels, a hollow space in between. Yeah.
Hollow it, or they just, with the flat space, they hollow a little bit out for.
Well, they keep those two boards would be separated by a couple of inches in the situations I saw in Europe. So the inside of the hive would be wood, and then there would be a gap before there would be another outside rim to that same box, and that outside rim would be a couple of inches away from the inside one, and that space in between, because even just having an empty space is a good insulation between the two walls, but having that empty space filled with insulation was, that's not so different from our homes, is it? Because we have siding on the outside, we have 2x4s, 2x6s, whatever we're using, and then an inside wall. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, and huh, I don't know. Again, the styrofoam hives. I love them. They're a lot thicker, and they're pretty much do. But I think ideally, that would be the most ideal form of insulation: a double layered wall with some airspace between the two layers. Because have you seen those? Maybe if a way to seal the air gap. But have you seen the way they do the beehives in England, where they have the beehive and then around it they have that shell?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, huh?
Yeah, it certainly is. There is that among the old timer beekeepers, not so much anymore. They use a smaller colony of bees. Typically, the national hive in England is a bit smaller. But I've also seen pictures taken and say at Guelph University,
Yeah,
where they're overwintering inside of Canada in Ontario, and they have also exactly what you described, a colony that is in a box year around, except during the winter when another big box is slipped over top, and that big box is stuffed full of leaves and straw and such.
right. Yeah, and yeah, I guess so. We talked a little bit about
The article, yep.
the article. Yeah, I guess there's a bunch of people commenting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, so this is the last one. So a novice commented, while I suppose the terminology has changed somewhat in the last 40 years, his concern that the cluster does not insulate itself is more of an emotional than a technical argument. His criteria for defining insulation is new to me, but no matter. Whether the layers of bees insulate or are a heat sink is irrelevant. He may be correct that there are people who think that our clusters get smaller, its thermal conductivity gets down. However, that would make a cluster of bees sort of a magical thing, as there isn't a semi-solid material that follows that behavior. And looking at the cluster, it is apparent that the air does not pass through it easily. So, of course, as the cluster gets smaller, the conductivity of the cluster increases, so the temperature in the cluster becomes more uniform. A smaller cluster has a smaller surface area, therefore losses somewhat less heat by conduction and convection from its surface relevant to the temperature of its surrounding. There are a lot of interrelated factors, so analysis gets complicated. Obviously, reducing the heat transfer through the box by conduction and convection reduces the temperature difference between the inside of the box and outside of the cluster, while insulating the hives may encourage earlier brood rearing and may even increase winter survivor in the more northern region. Most beekeepers with more than few hives still winter larger colonies in wooden boxes, as it's economically and reasonably effective. The math in the paper is actually accurate, as far as I can tell, and also apparently relevant. However, it appears to be mostly an advocacy piece of insulated hives.
That's very well put. That novice beekeeper seems to know what he was talking about. Thought that was good.
Some people give him heart emojis on this. So, yeah.
Well earned.
Yeah. But, it goes on and on and on. And there's Greg B. I laminated and before and I will again, many researchers are lacking wide knowledge of context. That they may be excellent specialists, but at the same time, width of knowledge is just not there. So to understand their own findings, too often they dig very deep and don't know what is going above ground level. This is to remind that bees naturally thrived in very unhospitable conditions for hundreds of thousands of years before people even showed up. Look at the documented isotherms where bees in winter, in a natural bee tree frozen through. When bees winter in the natural tree, frozen through and through, both below and above bees in cold climates of I don't know, some Basco Rostan. Do you see much insulation? There is none. Indeed, they winter is frozen tree cavity with massive thermal mass all around them. Lots of thermal mass, no insulation. Give it a thought. Okay, I don't know. This guy really got pissed off. I specifically marked a reading of negative 20 degrees Celsius. This is to show the temperature above bees is also negative. This is because the temperature of thermal mass above the bees is cold as outside temperature. He's showing a cluster of bees. And so I'll show everyone this picture.
Sure. And make sure we give people the links to the location that you're reading these comments, and also the link to that article that was in the physics journal that you
but this Greg D added a newspaper expert in his comment in Russian or Ukrainian. I'm guessing Russian because he mentions Bashko Horostan, which is probably somewhere in the north of Russia. And in the newspaper clipping, there is a diagram, a grid of numbers that are clustered all around, and there's a small inner cluster, a bigger cluster, cluster of numbers on a data board, and that's supposed to represent a cluster of bees. And inside the cluster, it shows a temperature of 25 degrees and it gets 22, 21, it gets smaller. And then right on the outer edge is a negative 22 degrees. And this beehive supposedly was surviving in a winter in a tree hollow or some sort.
very natural. Yeah. So the bees do create this cluster in order to survive very cold temperatures, which is what I mentioned a few moments ago when I said that I have seen photographs of a cluster of bees in a tree in the middle of the winter in Alberta, where the temperatures do get to be minus 20, and they were not inside the tree, they were on the outside of the tree. However, I want to quickly add, so that no one gets the wrong idea, you do need to winter your bees properly going into the winter, well-fed colonies and well insulated, which is also what this PhD candidate has been wanting to do. Okay.
I should mention that while it was negative 22 degrees on the outer layer, and then the first layer of bees was, some of them were, anywhere from ranging from -2 to -4 degrees. And then it significantly increased at each layer. But
yes. But once again, wrapping your hives for winter is I would say it's a requirement. I know one outfit operated by a relatively new beekeeper who lost all his bees because he didn't get them wrapped over the winter. We're hoping that they would be okay. And they weren't. They do die with their, you can wrap them late. You can go all the way up into the end of November, early December, if you don't mind struggling with cold weather, winter winds, blizzards, and moving away a little bit of snow in order to get to the colony and then wrapping the insulation around it. It's much better to wrap up, I'd say, around the 1st of November, the end of October, and leave them wrapped late. And we were going to come to this point again. You mentioned you're going to look at your bees in March, open everything up, maybe take the insulation off in order to access the colony properly, but then wrap it up again, because it's so important for these bees to stay wrapped late into the year. If they're not wrapped up late into the year, then they have a great opportunity of losing their brood as they're expanding the brood nest, say in April or May. So a lot of beekeepers have taken unwrapping the bees sometime in the month of May at our latitude and in our locations around here.
And how late? Oh, sorry, May until
May.
End of May or early May?
I'd say mid-May, but yes, around that time.
Right.
Yeah. But you do want them to be flying by then, because in our location, by about the 20th of April, there can be a really good pollen flow going on. Right. So you want them to have that natural pollen. You might feed them pollen cakes in March and early April, but they need to also be able to fly in order to defecate and in order to bring in fresh pollen if that's available. But you also want the colony to be well wrapped late into the spring and not take that wrapping off too early.
Yes. And could there be a case of that, you got a really strong colony and, they're about to swarm. You don't want to keep them wrapped.
It's extremely unlikely that they're going to be... no, you're right. You would not want them to be wrapped on the last week or so of May when there is a high probability of swarming. But that's more for management than to, you don't want to stunt them. If these bees are growing into a really strong colony of bees, maybe what you want to do in early May, when you've got these 12 frames of brood and 2 boxes full of bees top and bottom, you may want to order another queen and split the colony.
Right. So they're not going to have the just because of the environment, and they sense that the time period of the year, they're not going to want to swarm until May.
Well, they'll swarm when they get really crowded, when there's nowhere for the queen to lay, and if that is the result of fresh food coming in from the field. We usually don't have that problem until the dandelions come in a good, in a heavy flow. So you'll see dandelions sometime in April, but it's not until maybe used to be May 25th was the peak of our dandelion flow here in this area, though it's somehow managed to creep a little bit earlier. So by now it's closer to the 10th to 15th of May that the dandelion is reaching its peak. So I would suggest that that's a good time to be splitting your colonies. And then there are beekeepers who make these splits in early or mid-May and insulate the split box, because suddenly you have a much smaller colony of bees with several big frames of brood, and they risk losing that brood because we can get really cold temperatures even at the end of May.
Right. Yeah, exactly. There's we've had instances where it snowed in April.
Yeah, it snowed in May. That used to be
but yeah, it's even snowed in May. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes heavy snow. By then the leaves are out on the trees, and you get these really heavy snowfalls with really wet snow, and it breaks the branches on trees all around our city. Yeah. So let's wrap this up with a few more comments about what a beekeeper should be doing in mid-January. And I'm trying to say, do as little as you possibly can. You don't want to shake the hives. You don't want to unpack the snow from around the hives. You don't want to move the hives. That would be an awful thing to have to do at our climatic location. You don't want to be disturbing them much at all. But you may find warm days in January and February when skunks come around, or also at the same time of the year, or you have really strong winds that will unwrap some of this heavy insulation you put on or blow a lid off. So most beekeepers will get into a habit of driving around and taking a quick look at all their bees, maybe every week or every second week during the winter, just to see that skunks aren't pawing away at the entrances of the colonies, in which case you may have to turn up and remove and take those skunks to another location where somebody else is keeping bees and not you. Or You want to also look and see if the wind has loosened up insulation or taken a lid off, which you would need to replace as quickly as you can so that the colony will stay a little warm.
The skunks, I was worried about mice, but now you got me worried about skunks.
Well, they certainly get around during the winter on nice mild days, that's for sure.
They're attracted to honey?
Or they're attracted to bees, They like to eat bees. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You got any skunks in your neighborhood?
Oh, yes. Yeah, not today, but we certainly have them wandering through. We're towards the middle of a city of 1.5 million people with, built up for miles around us, but yet we have deer, moose, a few bear, and certainly skunks that wander around our neighborhood from time to time. It's the skunks I worry the most about. The deer aren't too bad. They don't usually nudge the colonies like a cow would. If I had the bees out on a pasture, then I worry about cows rubbing up against the boxes and inadvertently knocking them over. But the skunks are a pest for us, those of us who keep bees. And also those of us who don't like nasty smells, then they're a pest for them.
My dog got sprayed by one.
Really?
He loves chasing them.
Oh, and it hasn't learned? It does that?
It's got sprayed once, but yeah, it hasn't really learned. It still chases after them.
Okay.
It's a little bit more cautious because it hasn't gotten at a direct hit since.
What did you do when you had this dog covered in this oil coming out of a skunk?
I don't know if it got a direct hit, but it smelled so strong on it. Thankfully, just using dog shampoo, we were able to get it out just over and over. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The smell, but it was in the house. The smell was so strong. It was unbearable. You wanted to leave the house, which is that.
Oh, yeah.
Intentions it works. Mm-hmm. It really does work.
It's a protection for the skunk to keep the animals from bothering it. And yes, it really works.
It makes you want to leave the area.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's like a rotting body corpse in the area. So you think that your brain is like, you're in a diseased area, leave immediately. That's what you're right. Yeah.
Right. That's how we survived over millions of years, is by not eating dead bodies and by not being around things that might be breeding diseases. So those of us who smelled that, those of our ancestors who smelled those kinds of odors, they survived because they said, I don't like this, I'm getting out of here.
Yes. The skunk is exploiting that evolution.
Yeah, I guess it would be. And I don't know how bigger predators like wolves or, coyotes and so on around here, how they feel about, getting close to a skunk. I suppose if they could jump on it before it has a chance to hit them, then they would probably look at it as a meal. I had an uncle, is actually my mother's uncle, who was a new immigrant to North America, and they didn't have much money. But this as a youngster, he could ride his bicycle around everywhere and trap, kill, and skin skunks, because at one time skunk pelts were worth a lot. He was born without a sense of smell. He couldn't detect any odors. It must have been awful, like the eating food and so on. It would have, just the blandest, no taste kind of thing going on. But he was able to make a childhood nice income by being the kid who smelled the worst in the school. And he wouldn't know that he smelled bad, the poor guy. His name was Frankie. And so little Frankie, I always picture him like he would have been an old man when I was a kid. And I just kind of pictured like he made use. He made use of a disability. And, looking back, you got to say, yeah, that was pretty cool. He couldn't smell things. He couldn't enjoy that part of life. But look at him make money by capturing skunks, and nobody else would do it. How
That's,
about that?
we always got to look at the silver lining, and sometimes we miss it. But there's always, there's always a silver lining. I mean, there's 99% of the case. I would say there's always a 1%. There's always exceptions to the rule, but most of the time there's always a silver lining.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. Sometimes, like you say, the black cloud is bigger and wetter than we would like, but often you can look for some advantage to come out of a bad situation. Anyway, those are the skunks. It could be bothering the hives in the middle of the winter, and in that case, you will want to set up some traps. Now, how do you recognize if a skunk has been bothering the hives? You would normally see scratches in front of the box. So the skunk would have been ripping, pulling the snow to make noises, so the bees will come out and investigate. Now, one way of precluding this would be to close the bottom entrance completely so the bees can't get out.
Yeah.
And then if the skunk comes up and starts scratching the front of the hive, nothing comes out. And the bees may feel it and hear it, but the skunk will leave them alone because there's no food opportunity there for the skunk. So the skunk moves on and looks for some other easier prey to access.
So did you ever put any metal guards on your entrances to protect your hives?
No, but usually, well, I shouldn't say no, because over the years, I'm sure I had some off and on that I either purchased somebody's bees or tried out something, but I would typically reduce the entrance and maybe close it entirely for the winter. And because I'm hoping and expecting that snow's going to cover it anyway. And if I close that off or just leave just enough for air to get through so that mice can't get in, because mice are a big problem. They will look for a warm, dry place, which is the definition of a beehive, and that's where they will live. And they don't intend to bother the bees. They don't eat the bees, but what they do is they make little squeaky noises and push around with their sharp little teeth and make a mess of the wax. And you have to throw away the equipment if they've been hit by mice, because they're going to be pretty filthy, the equipment itself. But all this disturbance is what we were talking about earlier, and the gentleman who was concerned about a seismic crew going through and igniting these low intensity buried bits of charge that would shake the ground. He thought about all the shaking is going to disturb the bees, and they're going to break cluster. They're not going to survive as well. Well, we worry about the same thing with mice in a hive, that they interfere with the cluster of the bees.
Oh, I see.
And whether the cluster is a heat sink or insulation, I don't think that matters. I think the bees cluster. And in normal conditions, how we winter most of our hives, I think it's possible to winter hives without having clusters, that you have an enormous amount of insulation around them, or put them inside of the building for the winter. Then maybe they're not clustered. But I think they even cluster, at least by our perception. I'm going to say, even at a temperature well above freezing, like let's say 50 Fahrenheit, 10 Celsius, you pull off the lid, they're not spread out from one end of the hive, all across the top bars to the other side. Normally, you'll find something of a cluster where most of the bees are. Even though it's not bitterly cold, they're kind of conserving heat, staying close to the queen, warming up where the queen has to lay her eggs. So that's just typical. It's just what we normally would see.
Wow. This is so on top of the not wanting to bother them too much, right? I've heard that some people will do oxalic acid drops in January or in wintertime. Have you seen this?
I really don't. I can't answer anything about that. I don't know, what latitude they're at. Maybe they're in Kentucky and not in Alberta. I don't know that, and I also have never done it myself, so I can't really be, objective and say I've seen it, I know about it, or I've talked to people who've done it. I don't
But
know that, but I just personally, I would say that unless the temperature is way up there in January, which we can occasionally get, then I would avoid opening the hive up and dropping anything, even oxalic acid, into the hive.
why I bring that up is like you wouldn't be doing any sort of varroa mite treatment in wintertime, if anything. Any
I would not.
nothing. Okay.
Right. Right. I'm hoping that we have taken care of that in the fall and then get in there when they're active again in the spring, maybe in March when there isn't a lot of brood. And then, because obviously the more brood there is in a hive, then the more opportunity there is for the mites to hide. And that's what people who would be treating in January or February are hoping, that they're avoiding any sealed brood and obviously any place where the mites are in residence.
Yeah. I think, what else do you think we got left to talk about for, I think,
I'm really happy with what we've covered, Bidzina. I think, the key points here are it's midwinter. You want to avoid bothering the bees as much as possible. You want to be sure that you've done a nice job of feeding them well, treating them for pests and diseases, and keeping the insulation around the hives until late into the spring. And in midwinter, your main chores are to be sure that animal pests, and that includes humans, haven't come along and mischievously lifted up lids or knocked colonies over. If you're keeping bees out in the open prairie, then there's a good chance that cattle have visited the colony. They don't mean to do any harm, but they will rub their thick fur up because they're itchy, they're scratchy, itchy and scratchy. And they're going to try to relieve that mat of hair and inadvertently knock some colonies over. So your principal job then is not to interfere, but to remedy anything that seems to be going wrong in the middle of the winter.
right. Right. So I guess should we end it? Should we end it there?
I'd like to. I think we've covered this really well, and we are going to have some. We're going to we're going to have some more episodes similar to this as the season progresses, and we can talk about how your bees are looking, how my 2 hives in the backyard are doing. That when are you coming out to look at them? By the way, Bidzina, what if a lid has blown off? Like
I was hoping that you would keep an eye on them while I was not there.
I guess I could, since I can see them outside my bedroom window. They looked fine this morning, by the way.
Okay, that's good. What isn't Misty doing his job and staying guard duty?
He does. Our little Maltese dog does bark his little head off if a skunk comes wandering by. He also tries to warn us about deer. And I think that probably has a good effect in keeping most animals away from the beehives. But Bidzina, I think it takes more than a dog to raise a colony of bees. So I have to help too.
Takes a village.
Takes a village to raise a colony. Okay. I think we've kind of neared the end of our welcome for most of our guests. Any of you still listening? Thanks for hanging on to the end. Bidzina is going to drive us home from here.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Join us every Monday for a fresh episode at 8 a.m. at Mountain Standard Time for another beekeeping conversation. And I have my cat here, Miss Mittens. She says goodbye to everyone, and she's a little cranky. I kind of got her
That doesn't look so much like a cat. You just held up a big black ball of fur. It reminds me of the Tribbles on the old Star Trek series. Anyway, bye, folks. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.